Hey, it's Katie Moran.
And MJ Coppola.
We're sharing an 11-part mindful mental health mini-series called RNTKY, sharing 11 reasons not to kill yourself. It started as a blog post, YouTube video, and now a Discord community where we host gratitude challenges. Episodes will be coming out Tuesdays and Thursdays between Thanksgiving and New Year's Day. Today is a very special episode, and this is one of the deepest ones and deepest reasons why I am still here. And that's there are stories you haven't heard. And for a lot of writers out there, there's also stories you haven't told.
Yeah, I love this one. Like as a writer, I think of how, when I was a teenager, I wrote these super deep, like really heart-wrenching poems. And then I stopped writing for a while. And then I restarted writing very recently, last like few years. And I think to myself, like all those words that I haven't out. My first book was one totally like a collaboration of my teenage years. And then the second book was, more or less like my 30s. And those two were completely different. I was able to figure out like how to evolve and the emotions in those totally were two different, in my mind, there are two different books. And I think like if I wasn't alive, if I didn't stay, that those two, first of all, the books wouldn't have come out, but second of all, I wouldn't have been able to, evolve, and some of those thoughts and emotions wouldn't be available for other people to experience as well. Um, Along with like so many books that not only books, but people's stories that I haven't never heard before. It wasn't until like my 30s that I came across this The Moth, and I know a lot of people are probably really familiar with it, but um, I believe it was a podcaster who I was listening to the podcast, and they suggested this book, and it was The Moth, and it was just a collection of stories. But then I started to really dive deep and realize that there are so like everyone has a story, and I believe that if we sit with people for, more than 5 minutes, if you really know the questions to ask, you'll you'll get a story. Like everybody has something to say about their life. Everybody's been through something. Um, so it's just so lovely to be able to like sit here and say like there are so many things that I just don't I haven't experienced and haven't heard about, and it's I love stories so much, so it's a good reason to stay.
Yeah, for me, after writing my first book, I think one of the most like meaningful things people can like say to me is like about my book, or like any kind of like fiction I write. I feel like that's probably like the most meaningful kind of like thing that anyone could say, because I feel like it's something that wouldn't be here if I wasn't here. And it just like reminds me of how important it was that I stayed, that I could like create something that was meaningful to someone else and that we could like bond over it. And I think a lot of people feel like their existence doesn't matter. And I know for me, that's how I felt. And now to just see like all the ways that it matters to the people around me is so powerful. And it always reminds me that there's hope, and that when we see that there's hope, we have the responsibility to remind other people.
Yeah, I also feel like the more stories I hear, the more I experience people telling me their stories, the more I realize that, with permission, obviously, that sometimes people don't meet, right? So, say a friend of mine tells me a story about her life and something she experienced, and I have another friend from somewhere else, and they would never meet under any circumstances, probably. But that person's going through something that this other person's story, you know, really would help them. And, with permission, I can tell that person's story to this other person, and they can feel connected, like they're not, alone through that. You know, it's not maybe something that I could have experienced because it's just not something I would have, but I can tell that story to somebody else. And in that, we feel like there's a connection there. Um, so,
Yeah, and for me, I was suicidal for like a span of 3 years, and I had attempted suicide like around 8 times, and one of the things that really stopped me from attempting suicide was watching the play Elephant Man, and it was so powerful when I watched it, and it reminded me that, like, we all have a purpose, and that even if we feel dehumanized, because I felt so dehumanized by the way people treated me, by my superficial relationships, and just like after sexual assault, like it was very hard for me to feel like myself again. And that was a play that really changed my perspective, that we're all lovable, that even if we're dehumanized, that doesn't mean our life is any less worthy of living, and that we don't have to dehumanize ourselves, and we don't have to believe that we're defined by the way people treat us, which I think is so important to recognize. And I feel like now is the most important time to realize it, just because of so many people on social media. I think like the next generation just growing up with social media, like it can feel like the way people perceive us is the real us. And so much of like what we put out on social media, like I think you get to see like over time, because we didn't grow up with it. I think it's so important to recognize that we get to be ourselves, and that we don't have to like say people say something about our body. Like I recently got like horrible comments about my body, and I didn't have to take that on as the truth for me, and it was okay for me to just say that that behavior is unacceptable and to block that person. But I do see that if you're growing up in this kind of society, you might not believe that you could just block someone. You might not believe that what other people say about you isn't true. And I just want to remind everyone that you're not defined by the way people treat you.
yeah, I think it's really important. I remember growing up that I really did think that it was important for me to really take on every criticism that anybody ever had of me. And, you know, maybe that's for whatever reason that happened to me, but I see that in a lot of people. And as I've grown and went through, you know, my series of therapy and coaching and really started to lean into the authenticity of who I am, I'm realizing that it really isn't, especially the negative comments, they're not necessarily a reflection of who you are. They're more a reflection of who the other person, you know, is at that moment. And it's really hard to see that sometimes, especially when we're in a place of rawness and self-doubt, like extreme self-doubt. It's really hard to hear that um, society or other people who have different things to say and not so nice things to say about you, um, they're really not saying it about you. Um, but I definitely know how that feels, and it's yucky. And um, but you still matter, and your view of yourself can change based on the beauty of the person that you are.
Yeah, I think that is so beautiful. And it reminds me of like other stories that have really been so important to me, and just like the idea that we can hear a story, and again, like if we are defining who we are by how other people see us, we can remind ourselves to rewrite our story, and that we don't have to stay stuck in someone else's narrative. And that's what's really powerful to me about the book The Color Purple, is that the main character, she overcomes like abuse, and she really like rebuilds her life to a place where she has a lot of autonomy. And I think that's so powerful, and she comes from a place of forgiveness and wholeness, and it's really beautiful to see how empowered she is by the end of the book. And that reminded me that I could do the same thing in my life. And I felt like it was permission that I could. It was a point of hope that I could. And when I read that, I wasn't in a place where I had felt those things before I'd read them. And I think there's so many books out there that have the power to heal. And whether it be something you're writing yourself or something that you're going to read, I just encourage everyone to look for those books, and look for those stories and tell those stories. I also was really impacted by Stephen King's Different Seasons book, which it has novellas in it, and it's like Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me, which is The Body, and that one was really powerful to me, for both of those stories. But Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, it's just so powerful, like the story about hope, and he overcomes sexual abuse in prison, and just some of the story of it like really touched me. And he gets his freedom at the end, and his friend, I think it's so beautiful because the whole story, they have this symbol of hope, and they're talking about how it's so dangerous to have hope and things like that, and that's in the movie too. But the thing that's different is in the end of the book, the very ending is the character who just got off of is like on parole and just got out of prison, and he says I hope, and he says all the things that he hopes, and then at the end he just says I hope. And I think it's like so powerful, just that like it's like she really shows kind of like this like journey of this character believing that hope is dangerous, and then actually like living a life where he's free and he believes in hope, and just kind of like the parallels between like whether or not like freedom and the truth to freedom, and kind of like, as Viktor Frankl, the last freedom is our hope.
Yeah, it that is, I remember that story. It's been a while since I read it, but I remember thinking how incredibly crazy it is that we can, that character in particular can start off with such a like a radical view of a thing and end up in a completely different viewpoint. And it's such a great example of how you can change your mind, um, to fit, uh, not just surviving, but also thriving, you know, in any environment that you're given. Um, One of the books that I read a lot over and over is The Alchemist. And I find that I think when we have certain books, like we have certain stories that we love, that we can hear different versions of that story every time we read it or every time we hear it. And I think that's so, it's a really great, for me, it's a really good gauge of like where I am in my mental health, the things that I hear. And sometimes I hear certain messages in the book, like certain like lessons differently, or I'll hear one again the same way that I heard it like a couple of years back. And I'm like, oh, maybe that's like a good indication of like where my mind is at this particular moment. And I kind of use that as sometimes as a gauge, of like where I am mentally. But it gives me hope, and it, um, sometimes we can have stories as like blankets, like comforts, like TV shows and stuff like that. We talk about that sometimes, how I literally have both the written version of The Alchemist and the version, an audible version. And it's like a comfort. Sometimes I'll have like the worst day, and like it doesn't even matter what part of the book I'm on. I'll just press play and it'll just go, and I can just like have it on in the background, and it'll be something that just is a comfort.
Yeah, that reminds me, a few years ago, I was depressed and I wasn't really telling a lot of people about it. It was before I had started growing online and doing advocacy. Um, and my friend just like out of the blue sent me this hand painted, she painted it herself, like painting, and it was an alchemist quote on it. And I remember reading it and just being like, this is so exactly what I needed. And just to feel like someone cared for me enough to do that. And like it was out of the blue. Like she had my address and she must have sent it like I guess a week earlier. I have it actually right up here. And it says, listen to your heart. It knows all things because it came from the soul of the world and it will one day return there.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like one of the things that I feel like you never know like what's next. And I always say that I have a video and that's like the theme of it, which like I tell my story and the message of it is you don't know what's next. And in all the like sad things that happened to me, there was so much good that came from that, from the lessons I learned from that and from the healing work I did from it. And I always think about just how like sometimes when we're in those low places, we don't believe that what's next could be something that's meaningful and powerful and that something that is healing. And going deeper into that, so Stephen King was one of those, like he's my favorite author and he's just like so incredible. But I actually did like I would ask questions on X, which was Twitter. And I would ask like writers, like, and it'd be like a question like about writing. And one time in this year in January, Stephen King actually responded to one and it was about the
I
Oxford
remember
comma.
that.
Yeah, it was like yes or no to the Oxford comma. And he said either comma away, comma, I, comma, believe. And it was just like so beautiful. It's like the pinnacle of like anything that could ever happen to me on X or Twitter. And it meant so much to me and it actually brought me a lot of healing because I was healing from a relationship that I felt like I wasn't good enough for my partner in. And I felt like we weren't together because I just wasn't good enough. And I think so much of the time we all feel like we aren't good enough for whatever it is that we truly want. And it just was a reminder that what's meant for me will find me and that there's healing in that feeling of not being good enough and that it'll be replaced with something that's more beautiful and something that can be shared. And for me, I always think that that's going to be hope.
Mm. Yeah, I do remember that too. I remember like that very specific thing happening, and I was like, "Oh, that's so cool." And it kind of reminds me of how it reminds me a little bit about how, like, again with the invisible impact, and it's just so like the concept of that is just so important, I think, to bring up that you really don't like, and I think people who are quote famous kind of understand, or some of them understand this a lot more than maybe someone who hasn't gotten there yet. But the words that you say, the things that you do, I think it was Gandhi. I literally have it like as a plaster quote on my phone that says, "My life is my message," and it's just a direction in which to go. Like, what does my actions, what are my words, what is other people's words, like, how does that impact me, how does that impact other people, and really living this way of, is this true to myself, as a guide to authenticity. And I think about how he unknowingly, just by saying something quippy and funny to your, your comment or your post, like, helped you heal from something. And I've had musicians, back in the day when I was a music journalist, I'd have musicians once in a while, I'd have somebody that I like idolized, comment on something, or somebody ask about something, and I'm like, that's just, and it made me so happy for that day or that week, like that my existence was just acknowledged for that one moment. by somebody that I consider to be, an expert in their field. It is a dangerous road. You can kind of get addicted to that like need for validation. But I think it can be so powerful, like it if it's not abused. Um, you know.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of someone like Stephen King is that you don't really see him necessarily as someone who's famous. You see him as someone who's a storyteller. And like for me, it was like that idea of hope just coming back and just kind of like being like, you never know what's next. And it felt like really full circle because I was reading his book It, and it was just really like a great moment. And I think having milestones in your life is something that's really powerful. um I've never really felt necessarily connected to external validation. I've always felt um like some of external validation felt meaningless and numb, and just because a lot of external validation comes with criticism. And I think it's so important to recognize that you really can't get external validation. I don't see any way you could get external validation without getting just as much criticism. um like I think putting yourself out there is incredible if you can impact people, and specifically like that invisible impact is something that is really powerful. But also at the same time, you might not know the good you're doing for people, and you might be getting all of the hate. And I've been in situations where the hate was more than the good I was doing, and it was really hard to like keep going. And even when I got that hate comment, I think it was like the Saturday before Halloween, like I cried. It was just like, it was like he talked about like racism, about my body, and it was just like he made racist comments. He didn't talk about racism. I say it like he was like responsibly talking about racism, and like 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 that's just like
Yeah, it
that's
was.
the way yeah, I just don't have the vocabulary for it because it so rarely happens. But yeah, and like it was so hard. Like I couldn't normally, I can really like handle criticism, and I usually like make a statement about something someone says to me. But that one was just so hard because I felt like it was one of like the things that was like so hard for me to overcome in my own life, which was feeling dehumanized. And the comments he made about my body made me feel dehumanized. He compared me to a cattle. And then for him to kind of like make racist comments, like that got so deep under my skin that I just broke down. And I think sometimes with invisible impact, you have to have faith that you're helping people, but at the same time, sometimes the hate is more than what you can see as the help. And it's really like, again, believing in hope, believing in faith, and holding on to those good moments. And again, like I think it's hard to get addicted to external validation in today's world, just because there's so much hate that comes along with
Mm,
it. um but I do see that there's a danger to everything,
mm,
just in general. Like I think anything that's not in moderation can be harmful.
mm,
um but I think today, like a lot of making a difference is being strong enough to face the opposition, which can help you gain momentum, help you clarify your message. But sometimes all it is damaging and detrimental. And how you face that is something that allows you to keep going. And I think if someone told me how much hate I would receive when I was suicidal, I wouldn't have been able to handle it. I wouldn't have believed that I would just go about my day and hear the comments I hear. I would not have believed that I would have been okay with that. Um because so much of the way people act and behave online when they're sending hate just is not okay. And I think the way people are so anonymous, it's really sad. It's really sad that people
Mm.
feel like they can send people hate like that. But again, it's so important to recognize that even what people say to you, even if it's an insecurity you have, it doesn't have to become your truth, and it doesn't have to become your story. And that's something I think you can understand and you can know, but you have to put it to practice with every comment. You constantly have to put that into practice. And I asked Tom Billy a question about this, about getting criticism or negative feedback, and he just said it always stings. And he has millions of followers on YouTube now, and just the thought that he says like it never stops stinging is something that I was like, wow, like that says a lot. But he said like the more you keep going, like the more you learn how to protect yourself. And he says like at like the million mark, sometimes like you don't even like read comments, and it's just not something that is accessible to you. And I thought that was really incredible. But he said like the more attention you get, the more hate you get. And I think that's something that is really telling about our society. Like I believe in the goodness of people. I truly do. And that's what I always look for, and that's what I create content for, and that's what I write for. And so much of the time we don't recognize that even how we see the world, there could be opposition to that, and that we are stronger than it when we face it.
Absolutely. Uh, I really, it kind of reminds me a little bit, um, back in the day when I was going to like studying Buddhism more often. And I remember my meditation teacher saying to me that uh, it was hard to hear at the moment, but I recognize it now, that I will likely feel like this. You know, it, the depression isn't probably going to go away, but we learn um, how to like heal with it. We learn how to, not make certain decisions during certain times of the year and stuff like that. And it was really, really hard for me to hear. And sometimes I'd go back to that and I would think about like, oh gosh, am I going to feel like this forever? But the truth is I don't. Um, it's just sometimes there are times of the year that are times for more rest than there are for more action. And it really does remind me of like what you said, how it's almost like I think about the things that I definitely was not ready for. Like if I had what I have right now, uh there's no way I would have been able to handle it back then. And I think there's like a rite of passage that you kind of, as you grow, I know like when we're kids, we're always like, oh, like I want to be a grown up. And then you get here and you're like, okay, all the things that I didn't even think of being a kid, like, paying bills and having to go to a job and like, all of those things. Um, it's it's like there's a reason why we go through what we go through. Um, Going back to something we said like in the beginning of the series, that we can't always see through the fog. We don't always know what's in front of us, but we do know that there is still other things, trees, a road, a path. And even though we can't see like 3 feet in front of us, maybe we can still see or at least experience where we are right now. And I think just the knowledge and the faith that there is something else around us. Maybe we can't see it, we're in a spot, but eventually the fog will clear, or we'll put ourselves in, we'll keep moving to a place where the fog really isn't so dense. Um, and in moderation. I mean, it really is like super important to realize that sometimes, um, we can have either too much or too little of something. Um, it can be hard to regulate that. So get help if you need it.
Yeah, that reminds me that everyone's story can change and that we are not defined by our circumstances, but by our courage to redefine those circumstances. And there's this saying I always have when I talk about my journey, and it's there's strength in our storms and beauty in our battles. And I always think about that when I'm feeling low, because there's something you could always look for that will be there, and that's something that you have to cultivate inside of you. And the more resilient you become, the easier it is to be resilient. And just how you said, like, if you had the struggles you have today 10 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten through them. And I think the same thing for me. Like, if I was getting all of the comments I get today, 10 years ago, I would not have been able to get through it. And I think because of all of the other ways I impact people, it seems like there's moderation in it. Like it's not like there's so much negativity that it offsets the good. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about, is that even when things get worse, that life is still worth living. And sometimes things do get worse, and that doesn't mean that you're not strong enough to handle it, because we are all stronger than what we face.
We're almost always, I don't think I've ever run into a time where I've seen a person who wasn't strong enough to deal with whatever they were facing. I think that as a human species, especially, we are super duper resilient, way more than we give ourselves credit for sure.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. Um, and there's this idea that I think stories can bring collective healing, that when we share a story, it takes something that maybe it's just ours, and when it's shared, it becomes ours, like as the collective ours, not just us ours.
Yay,
Um,
words.
yeah. Yeah, and well, I think there's like power in that, just that something that truly belongs to us, I feel like can always be shared. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about sharing your story through personal content and your personal brand, is like being so focused in on your story that people can see themselves in you, and that it's not really about them, but it's about how they see their story in your story. And I think like that distance gives people the opportunity to feel like it's not you lecturing them, but it's you just reminding them that whether it be the messages their existence matters, or that they're stronger than what they face, or that they're not alone. I think that's so important. And I think sometimes it's easier to see someone else go through something we're going through, or see someone who went through something we're going through and get through it, than it is for us to hear someone tell us we're going to get through what we're going through.
Oh my gosh, the number of times I heard someone go, but you're just so strong, you're going to make it. And it's so, in the time of the thing that you're going through, it feels so much like a slap in the face sometimes. It feels like, I know, but this is what it feels like. Like inherently, I think we know these things, but it's really hard to, you're in it, man. It's just like going back to the fog analogy, because it's probably one of my favorite ones now. And it's like, there might be a bridge you're on and you can't see, like the only thing you can see is just like the abyss surrounding you. Like it's hard to see the rest. And in that moment, it's like it's someone on the other side of the bridge can't see them because it's too foggy, and someone's like, you got this, like you're gonna make it to the end of the bridge, and you're like, that's great, but right now all I could see is space, like I can't see anything. um and I know how that feels. but later and later you'll think of that and go, I know that person meant the best and that person was actually cheering me on, you know. That's why I think it's really important. Like words, like stories are important. Like I think it's easier for someone in that space to hear a story about someone who was in that space one time and did make it, you know, as opposed to someone flat out telling them like, okay, take 2 steps to your left and then 5 steps over here, because sometimes we can't hear those directions. But if someone puts that in a form of a story, it's a lot more likely to be heard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I just think like how much more comforting would it be if like you're scared on a bridge and you can't see anything and someone's like shouting from the other side. I was so scared to take every step, but I got to the other side and it was just 1 foot in front of the other with the only 2 inches I could see in front of me. And like just like the comfort in knowing that someone like is feeling or has felt how you felt and that you're not in it alone, I think is something that is so powerful. And I think like it is something that like you have to give yourself grace with, because I think even when you share your story, sometimes there are people who just don't agree with it. There are people who just don't like you or don't like what you have to say. And people are always surprised when I say this, but I've received like so much hate that it's just the truth. Like it's like it doesn't matter if you're kind, it doesn't matter how much you work on your craft. There are people who are just full of hate and will give you hate, and sometimes they'll be really nice to other people. It's not like that's all they are. But just like I think one of the hardest things, and I talk about this when I talk to speakers, is knowing you can't reach everyone. I think it's the most challenging part about putting yourself out there and sharing your message, is that it's not going to reach everyone and it's not meant for everyone. And in blocking people, I think the real pain isn't necessarily that someone hurt you or someone is hurting you or someone is hurting people out there. I think it's that one person doesn't get to hear a message that you think could help them. And I think that's the hardest part about whether it be protecting your community by blocking someone who is aggressive and hateful, or just feeling like there's someone who you couldn't impact is, I think, hard. It's one of the hardest things. Or that like you couldn't help someone. I think specifically I see it in speakers and people with a particular message.
It's it really is like it's this probably is one of the hardest things. And I think like a parent could kind of understand it in a way that like, you know, when you tell your kid like, don't pick up that thing because it's gonna hurt, and they're like, I'm gonna pick up that thing. I need to learn for myself. Watching that kid make the mistake that you're like, I made this mistake. I've done this before. I know it sucks. Why are you doing that thing? It's like holding space for people who don't want you, or not don't want you, but don't either really can't hear your message or aren't ready to, or they just it's not a thing that they want, but you know that that's something that's like in their future, like a lesson that they're going to learn eventually. It, like it really is like top tier, one of my most hardest things I feel like the human race goes through.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more healed and authentic version of yourself you get, the more you see your unhealed version of yourself and other people, and the more you just want to like scoop them up and be like, I will take it for you, but you can't. Unfortunately, it's not something you can do. And having a daughter, um I think having anybody that you love, basically, you don't even have to be a parent, but having anybody you love go through something that you're like, man, I just want to take it for you because I already went through this and I know all the steps that I have to take, and but it's not yours to take. So it is hard. It's really hard. But we learn how to hold space for those people and or point them in a direction to somebody who maybe can hold space for them.
Hmm. Stories can enthrall, captivate, and change you. They can open your mind to things you've never known before and show you things you have never seen. Keep going and look out for these stories. Share these stories with others. So, MJ, if there's one message you want to leave everyone with today, what would that be?
Mm. Tell your story. Tell your story. There is someone out there who needs to, and like maybe not even your whole story, man. Maybe there's like a little snippet of life that replays in your head over and over, and you wish you could share it. Share it. Share it. Go on social media. And if you feel like you're in a spot where you can't take the hate that comes with that separation, ask someone to help you go through it. If you, or just turn off your comments. You don't have to have the criticism if you don't want to, um, but it is part of life, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think mine would even be like even more basic than that, and just like write your story, like whether it's like fiction, whether it's nonfiction, whether you're journaling, like just do it for you and get to the point where you know who you are,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have that self-awareness, and that you feel like you can rewrite your story and you don't have to hold on to the narratives other people have placed on you in your life, and just knowing that you can change that. And if that seems too big, then how we always talk about suspending negative feelings and rewatch your favorite story. And for me,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's watching Shawshank Redemption, sometimes that's reading something. But I think sometimes it can be that more immersive experience can be more powerful to suspend those feelings, and just believe that you can get through anything that you're going through.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for spending time with us today.